For this guy, I am working on Fabriano Artistico Extra White 300-pound watercolor paper. You will see that I've got masking tape, and this is just regular masking tape, so it has a lot of tack to it, taping all of the edges down because I don't size or stretch my watercolor paper before I start painting generally. I just tape the edges down, and that way if it starts to warp, I can take a hairdryer to it and it'll all go back into shape. So I'm starting, I've made a mixture of this olive green, and I am just blocking that in for the trees in the background. Now the first thing that I did before I even started this, because I knew I was going to be experimenting with a looser style than I generally do, I gave myself permission to completely screw this up. It was going to be totally okay if this came out terrible and I couldn't use it for the video and I had to start from scratch. That's a really big deal in setting your attitude to this place of I get to experiment with what I'm doing, and whatever happens, happens, because that's how we learn. So here I'm now working on the grass. I've added a lot of water. It's a slightly brighter green. And I'm going to leave these sketchy lines. I'm keeping them horizontal. This is important in making sure that the background feels like it's flat, like it's land. If you start making squiggly lines coming down vertically, it no longer looks like flat land in the background. It looks like the whole world is kind of tilting to one side, and it gives it a really, not even surreal, more distorted look. So see how I'm keeping these lines very sketchy, side to side. Long horizontal lines. My vertical lines are very, very short. So long horizontal, short vertical, long horizontal, short vertical. This is very similar to when you see me painting seafoam, the lines on, well, seafoam. The video that I did with the dolphins a while back with the teal and the damask in the background. If you watch that, I continuously talk about how I'm working that water and doing long horizontal, short vertical, long horizontal, short vertical. And it's the same in landscapes in order to keep the land mass back there looking flat. No matter what medium you're working in, you really want to make sure that you're staying with that long horizontal, short vertical thing. You start getting long vertical lines or long diagonal lines, everything starts looking distorted. Now I did use a ruler to make sure that my line in the background was completely horizontal. I checked both sides. It's really easy to end up with a lopsided horizon there, and that is not okay. Whenever you're doing any type of landscape work, that line has got to be horizontal, or it will look, again, goes back to having a very distorted landscape. That doesn't work out well. Now I've drawn this out with one of my Faber-Castell water-soluble graphite pencils. That way I don't have any graphite lines that stay. One of the things that's kind of funny with Inktense, they come in the set, it comes with a liner pencil, I think they call it an outliner, and that one won't lift off with water. That is a little silly to me. I want my pencil line to lift off with water. I don't want you to be able to see pencil lines underneath the ink paint that I'm putting on here. So I always use that water-soluble ink, or water-soluble pencil, I'm sorry, just to make sure that I'm not going to have pencil lines show through. I'm doing the same thing with my sky. I'm keeping my lines very horizontal so that any gaps just look like clouds. And I'm coming down all the way to where the grass is. Now, if you're going to do this project, you can get this photo or if you want to use this exact elephant, this photo is available for you from wildlifereferencephotos.com. You can pick up this photo or any individual photo for $5, or you can get a 5-pack for $10, which is how I always buy them. But that one's available there. If you want to create a similar background with a different elephant that is royalty free, you can also do that. Make sure, there was a thought that I was going for with this, but here you can see I've got the two gapped areas, the background land and then the grass that the elephant is standing on. So I'm leaving the rest of this white. I've darkened up some of that blue. Now, remember, the colors are not that big of a deal. If you do not have the same color set that I do or using the exact pencils, because I don't list which Inktense that I'm using. When I'm working with the blocks, it's hard to tell what color is what anyway. Make sure that your values are correct. If you've got your lights light enough and your darks dark enough, that's really all that matters. Here, I was just playing with colors. Whatever happened, happened. Now with the Inktense, while they're still wet, you can blend them out and keep smudging them and get the colors to move. Once they dry, that pigment is not coming up. This is water soluble ink. It is permanent. Don't confuse light fastness with permanence, because most of these are not light fast when water is added to them. I do have a video, the intro to working in whoops, got a little too much water there. Just going to dab that off with a paper towel. You can see how that lifted off pretty much completely. But I have a video going over how I'm mixing the paint, the flamingo and the bees, the first one that I did. You'll be able to see how I'm mixing the ink mixture with water in order to paint with a paintbrush like this. So make sure to check that out, and I will try to remember to put a link for you guys. Getting the tree trunks in here. I'm keeping this very loose. I don't want these too detailed. I want them just to be kind of fuzzy and then in the background. So I'm using a lot of water, which is part of why I'm having these tree trunks spread out so much, where I put down the ink and it just kind of spreads and ends up a lot wider than what I'm initially painting on there. Now, if you are used to doing projects that take you weeks or months to complete, that you're just putting tons and tons and tons of tiny detail in it, I strongly recommend do a looser piece like this, something that you can get done quickly. You can see the time of this video is under an hour. This was a very fast project. This is not sped up at all. This just went so quickly and was just so enjoyable to do. That I just came off on this one of having finished the tiger, which had a ton of detail in graphite, and now I'm currently working on, for next week's video, a colored pencil sea or underwater scene with sea turtle and fish, and there's so much detail. Doing this in between sort of reset my brain so I didn't start getting burnt out from creating art. Sometimes when you just spend so much time at the easel and it takes so long to see progression in your work, you can start just kind of feeling meh, don't really want to work on this right now. If you can do these quick little sketches, something fun, it really does make a difference in getting you reset, ready to do your next fully detailed piece. And with these, you're going to focus, when you're doing the loose stuff like this, you're focusing more on your lighting and your values and your contrast. So it's really good for strengthening those skills as well. Creating variation in the trees here. I don't want all of my brush strokes to look the same. No matter what style you're working in, you really want to watch that when you're doing landscapes. Don't make all your trees or your bushes look the same. If you get a brush stroke and you think, hey, it looks good when I do this, don't just keep doing the same thing or it won't look natural anymore. Having variation is really a big deal. You can see I'm keeping my hand pretty sketchy, just random strokes here. I'm adding this reddish brown in to tone down some of the green in the trees. Now, you don't want to go too crazy and add 800 colors in the background. That's a big deal too. Again, I want to keep it fairly simple and focus on my values. Now, one of the nice things for me with Inktense, because I know I'm not going to sell these until I can be sure that I can keep them fairly light fast by using UV spray and UV glass, that takes a lot of the pressure away too. I don't have to have everything perfect. I'm not selling it. This is just fun. So that's another added bonus with working in this medium. It's super fast to work in. You can get things done really quickly. You can put a lot of detail in them too if you want. You saw the flamingo and the red panda that I had done, but you don't have to. You can just so quickly get something like this done. So I'm going to block in the grass around the elephant. I'm using a lot of water with this. Now, one of the things with the Inktense, I do not like applying the blocks directly to the paper. It makes it so gritty and grainy looking, and it's not a look that I like. So that's why I always use a bit of water on my paintbrush and mix the ink right off the block. That gives me this nice smooth finish that I'm going for. I will use the pencils directly on the paper, but not the blocks. And usually the pencils I keep for the end of whatever project that I'm working on for little details. But for my main blocking in of colors, I always use the blocks pre-mixed like this. You see I've got areas that are a little bit darker and a little bit lighter, getting some variation in there. The other thing, if you're going to do something like this, that landmass that he's sitting on, make sure it doesn't look like a baked potato. You don't want this perfectly oval shape. You want to get that randomness where it kind of fades out at the edges. It'll look much better than a perfectly smooth outline. Coming back through with some darks now. Again, I want to keep variation in there. Now it looks like I'm dabbing, which I am. I'm dabbing the paper, but I'm not stabbing the paper. And that is a very important distinction. You don't want to continuously stab that. It won't look right. I've seen people do that a lot in their artwork, and it just does not come out right. Here, I've got the brush held sideways. This is a fairly large round, and I'm just dabbing that on there. Again, keeping that variation. With these, it's going to be better to go too light than too dark to start with. You can always darken things back up. You can, though, when I say that, you can still lighten them up with these because the white block is so opaque when it's dry. So you can, to an extent, fix mistakes or lighten things back up, but it's definitely easier just to start light and work your way to your darker colors. One of the best tips I can give you for working in Inktense is to make yourself little color charts or color samples of what all of these colors look like. Because my I guess two real complaints because the light fastness, but my other real complaint about these is that the color on the pencil does not look at all like the color that ends up coming out on the paper so often. So you definitely want to have little color charts so you have an idea of what you're actually going to get. If you don't have that, your other option is to take a piece of scratch paper, preferably whatever type of paper you're working on, and test out the colors on that before you hit your paper, because you don't want a big huge surprise once you touch that paper, because there's not a whole lot that you can do to fix it. I mean, you can lighten it up, but you'll always see that you had, if I came out with a bold magenta in one of these areas, it would be pretty obvious, even if I covered it with the white. So you want to test things out just a bit before you hit your paper. So I'm getting these longer lines again in the background, using a lot of water here. Again, keeping them with the long horizontal lines. Getting some more darks in these trees. Now when I do this, it is so important that I leave the light colors in the trees behind them still showing through. I'm not trying to cover all of the trees with the dark colors. As I layer each color, it's not a matter of getting that same color everywhere. I've got to let those previous layers show through in bits. These are just some of the shadows. Again, you want to keep variation. And this is one of those things, it doesn't necessarily look so good when you're up close, but when you back away from it, you're going to see, oh, okay, it does look like trees in the background. So you can take a photo with your phone so that you're looking at it on a small screen. That sometimes helps. Or just back away and look at it from across the room. Getting some little wisps for the grass in here. Notice how I'm curving my brush. I'm not doing a bunch of straight lines. If you make straight grass, it just looks too stiff and unnatural. So I'm getting these slight curves, and I'm using that same big brush, but I'm barely adding any pressure, which gives me the thinner lines. You can control how thin or thick your lines are based on how much pressure you add to the brush. Now, don't get frustrated with yourself if you are trying to get thin lines with a brush like this and they're coming out big, thick globs. It takes practice. That is not an overnight thing to get used to. While you are learning to control your brushes, you can switch to a smaller brush. You'll still learn while using the smaller one, but eventually you'll end up with so much control over your brushes that you don't have to switch as often. You can use the same brush for a lot of different techniques. I don't want to cover everything. I just want to give the hint of grass in there. Notice that my grass blades are also overlapping each other. I don't want them all so separate that they end up looking like a fence of sorts. I'm working in clusters, very much like I would do fur. Clumps and clusters. Pulling a little bit more of the darks in the background here. Again, following those long horizontal lines. Now make sure when you're painting, no matter which medium that you're working in, go right up against your subject. You can see that the trees touch the elephant. I would rather go a little over the elephant and have to work that into the design than have a gap between the trees and the elephant where he has like a glow around him. Let your background and your subject touch. Here I've switched to a smaller brush and I'm going to start outlining the dark areas on the elephant. Now the type of brushes that I'm using for the most part are Taklon bristled brushes. I think I have a few of the synthetic hog hair, but most of these are Taklon bristled brushes. I do recommend try out a few different brushes though, because they get just such different techniques depending on the look that you're trying to get. Now here where I'm doing the wrinkles in the nose, I'm not trying to copy this exactly, not even close, but I do want to get the movement and the motion of those wrinkles being in there. So I need to make sure that I am slightly curved. I don't want a bunch of straight lines or his trunk will look flat. I'm barely pushing on the brush to get these nice thin lines, and I'm copying the motion of the wrinkles from the reference photo, but not each individual line. I'm constantly looking up at my reference photo because even though I've sketched these out, I can't always trust what I sketched out, so I've got to keep looking at that photo to make sure I'm putting these going in the right direction. Sometimes when I sketch things, I start getting lazy, knowing, oh, I'll fix it when I start painting, which is something I recommend you guys don't do. But here with these lines, I got really loose and was just sketching them. Again, it was just such a loose sketch. I wasn't going for as exact as normal. Normally, I advise to make sure your drawing is completely accurate before you start painting. But again, this being that looser style, I just wasn't worried about it. I'm going to block in his eye so I don't lose that. And there's not going to be any more detail than what I've just done. I'm keeping it very simple. I just need to make sure that eye is in the right location. Now, quite a few of these lines, especially on the outlines, I've made a lot heavier than they are in the reference photo as well. I'm really outlining some of this, making these strokes much more bold than I normally would do. If you have a line that just ended up in the wrong spot, you weren't paying attention, don't throw your project away. Figure out how to work that into the piece. If something's too heavy, you can lighten it. I mean, there's just a lot of things that you can do. So don't give up if something, I mean, I'm looking at this scene where lines are overlapping where they shouldn't. I'm just going to work that in. It's no big deal at all. It's sort of like there was a musician, I want to say he was a guitarist. I forget what it was, but someone had asked him, how do you not ever make any mistakes? And he said, basically, he makes mistakes all the time, but when he makes that mistake, he repeats it over and over again so that people think it was intentional. So it's very similar with art. You can take something that was, oh my gosh, that was terrible, work it into the art, make it look like it was intentional. And obviously, you want to learn to have control, but if it happens, don't just trash the piece. Following the curve of his belly here. Now, normally, if I were painting in acrylics, I would get a base coat of a medium gray first before I did all of these lines. But with Inktense, they're so translucent that it actually works better for me to get all of my outlines in first, and then I'm going to fill him in. I'm still going to be able to see all of these outlines, and I'll come back through and strengthen them. But it just makes it a lot easier to do it this way, which seems so backwards from all the other mediums that I work in. But it works really well. I keep a paper towel next to me so I can continuously dab that brush on the towel in case I get too much water on it. Okay, I've mixed a lighter gray to fill in for the body. And by lighter gray, I mean I'm using the same colors I was on those lines, but I've added a lot of water to it, so it's very, very transparent. You can see all of the lines I previously did, so I can be pretty messy and blocking this in. So I'm not going to lose any of those lines. I did need to make sure that all those lines that I had done for the wrinkles were all dry, though. If it wasn't dry, I would just smudge them by putting wet paint on top or wet ink. And I'm using that same gray but less water to get these darker shadows. Now I took the brush where I had right there a lot of ink. It was very, very dark. I rinsed off the brush and I came back just with water and then smudged what was already on the paper so that it kind of faded out to those lighter areas out towards the end of the ear on the right. But that's all with the same shade of gray. You can see I can go right over the eye and that eye doesn't budge or smudge or anything. So I'm starting with the lighter gray there on that outside ear where the light is hitting stronger. Using this lighter gray for all of the highlighted areas as well. Because while they are lighter, I don't want them to just stay white. Now I'm pulling this magenta color in, not because that's what was in my reference photo, but because that's what I wanted in this piece. Again, like I was saying earlier, I just wanted to play and experiment. This wasn't an issue of making sure I copied everything exactly. It was more of a let's see what happens when I do this type of piece. So I'm darkening up those shadows with that magenta. I definitely wanted him more colorful than normal. And I'm taking a brownish tone to go right over some of these highlights. So he's not going to stay perfectly gray. And just warming up the areas that the sun would be hitting. And you can see I had gone too dark, too much of that orangey color on that leg, so I just dried off my brush and wiped some of it off with the same brush. Just going to smudge that around. Now I let those layers dry before I added more on top, using even more of this magenta tone. I've got a little bit of that brown mixed into it, which gives it a warmer feel. Starting to build up those shadows more. This is great for getting you used to having strong contrast, because I know that's sometimes very scary in our work, and it is so important in here because you can build up so quickly. If something comes out badly, it doesn't matter. You can start over again if you have to. But it's just such great practice for teaching yourself to get your darks dark enough up against the really light lights. I'm taking some of that magenta for the grass as well. Now I'm going to come back through and darken up my darks again. Now when I say that I'm darkening up my darks, I don't mean that I'm making all of the dark areas evenly dark. You can see that I'm starting to fade it to where the deepest areas of the shadow are what I'm working on now. softening that edge out by dabbing that with my finger. Taking a clean brush to smudge it would actually be more efficient or effective. I guess both words actually fit in this case. When I'm doing each of these brush strokes, I'm not just randomly putting brush strokes in there. I'm paying attention to where those lines and curves are and following those lines and curves with my brush. Even though I may not be copying exactly, it's still really important that everything's moving in the right direction. You can see I can get really thin lines even with this larger brush depending on how I'm holding it and how much pressure I'm adding. So I'm now darkening everything up even more on the darkest portions. Went a little too heavy there with the ink, so I've dabbed some of that off with my finger. Now, each of my brush strokes is not the same amount of pressure either. That's another thing to point out. The beginning of most of these brush strokes is going to be a little bit heavier, and I lift the brush off as I move towards the end. And it's an easy way to make it fade out. So like where I was working on the stomach, where it was darker towards the bottom, I'm adding more pressure to the brush at the bottom there, and as I pull up and round up towards the upper section of the stomach, I'm lifting the brush up. I'm doing that here as well. Where I want it to fade out, I start lifting the brush up on each of those strokes. Now I'm using the white pencil to get some of these highlights in there. Now this pencil doesn't show up that well. It's not as opaque as the Inktense block. What I just did there by putting my hand on the paper, I was making sure that it was dry. If that was still wet, the pencil wasn't going to stick very well. So I'm using the black pencil now and defining some of these wrinkles a little bit better. And I just use the same sharpeners that for these as I use for my colored pencil. The little handheld comb sharpeners I really like. Unless you're using Prismacolor pencils, then I don't like the handheld sharpeners. You would want to switch to an electric then. But for me, working with polychromos and luminance, I generally use these handheld comb sharpeners, and those work really well for the Inktense as well. I have the Derwent battery-operated one, but it seems to eat through these pencils a little faster than they would if I sharpen them by hand. Now when you add the pencil directly to the paper like this, you can leave it dry just how it is, or you can add water over it so it's more like what I do with adding the, wow, that word just left my mind, the paint thinner on colored pencils. When you add water over this, it makes it so much deeper and darker. Now, where some of these light portions hit, it may look really weird if you're copying your reference photo and you're like, why is this blocked in light right here? Copy it anyway. Because when you back up and look at it, it all starts to make sense why the light's hitting in certain areas. Now, here's one of those areas where I started coming back and really lining areas darker than they were on the photo, like the shadow underneath the tusks here. I really darkened that up a lot. I'm going to start darkening up areas on the edge of the trunk. All of this is going to be much more bold, a little bit more cartoony than what you typically would see me do. And again, it was one of those things where I gave myself permission to totally ruin this. I just wanted to have fun and experiment with these. But if you never give yourself that permission and you never experience or experiment with your whatever medium you're working in, you're not going to learn as much. You won't progress as much. So definitely get over the fear of messing something up and mess it up. Let that happen. If nothing else, you learned what not to do. The very best artists weren't afraid to mess things up. That's not to say that they never messed anything up. They just weren't afraid for that to happen. So I'm still defining these little wrinkles and the shadows. Now, I'll have people ask me quite often, should I get the blocks or the pencils first if I can only afford one? Usually I recommend go with the blocks because they're a bit more versatile. You can get super thin lines, little teeny tiny detail, but fill in large blocks as well because of the way that you can use the paintbrush with them to cover larger or small areas. With the pencils though, I love them for stuff like this, those little details. This can be done with the brush and the blocks, but this is so much easier to switch back and forth between them. The blocks and the pencils just complement each other so nicely. But if you are just wanting to give these a test run, a set of 12 blocks is totally enough for you to get started and get a feel for the medium. And they're pretty inexpensive. And if it is something that you like, they are available open stock, so you can add colors as you need them. Now the great thing here, some of those earlier wrinkles I had done, I've put so much ink on top of them that they're very subtle. You see them, but they're really subtle. Now I'm coming back through with these deeper wrinkles and it just gives me that much more texture, that much more depth in the skin. If I were to be doing an elephant like this and going for super realistic, I would still do it like this where I wasn't copying each exact wrinkle. I would go back and shade each wrinkle a little bit individually, but I wouldn't worry about each one being exact. Again, it would be for me about copying the movement of how those wrinkles, which direction they're going. And remember, when you put the pencil on the paper like this, it is going to look very different once you add water to it. So make sure that you test that out on a scratch piece of paper before you hit your actual project. It'll make your life much easier in the long run. See, I'm cleaning up the edges of my tusks there. That one was kind of a mess. Now you see that I had used an eraser there. The eraser will, to an extent, lift off dry pigment, or well, when it's applied dry. Once water has touched this ink at all, it is not lifting up. So where you saw me erasing, that's only because I had an area with the pencil that I had not yet added water to, that I wanted to lift up a bit. You can see I do a lot of cross hatching to get the look of these wrinkles. Just because this idea just hit me, I'm going to share this with you guys first. One of the problems that I know a lot of artists complain about is that it is sometimes so hard to find your style, to find something unique to yourself. And I noticed when doing this, my goal with this was to do something much looser, much more messy than I normally do. But honestly, it still, to me, looks a lot like what I already do. I mean, not super detailed, but it's so similar to what I do. So one of the things that I'm going to do, and I'm going to encourage a lot of artists to join in on this once I make my video of it, but I'm going to do the same elephant maybe 10, 15 times. I don't know how many times, but I'm going to require myself each time he has to be different. I'm going to trace him out. So every single, the background, the elephant himself, all of that's going to be the same, but I need to make each one look differently. Is that going to be in the brush strokes that I'm doing? Is it going to be in the colors that I'm doing? But in doing that 15 times the same thing, I'm probably going to start getting a little bit more bold and a little bit more creative because I've got to make it look different. You can only do this elephant so many times and still have it be different than the other ones before you start getting really creative. So this is something that I'm probably going to be doing in the very near future. If you guys want to jump in on this, I would love to see what you end up creating. And I'll announce that and ask everyone to share within our groups. But I think that it would just be a really fun way, just quick things like this, to get an idea of how to do different styles, to give yourself a little bit more bravery and trying something new. Because your first couple of times are probably going to be similar to what you already do. But when you're forcing yourself to do something different because you already did it, you're going to be bored doing the same one. I think it'll really give us more of a chance to get some different styles into our portfolio. Random Patreon thoughts. You guys will have to let me know if that made any sense to you. I get all excited about ideas and no one ever has any idea what I'm talking about. So here you can see where the shadows are on the belly. Look how dark that is. And that's just because I continuously cross-hatched with that pencil. Now I'm adding a bit of blue into the elephant. Not because he needed it, just because I was actually just experimenting again. It was one of those, let's see what happens if I do this moments. So I have the white Inktense block mixed with water on this brush. What I'm applying right now seems very translucent. When it dries though, it comes up more chalky, much more white. So be aware of that when you're working with the white. It does not look at all the same how it looks when you put it on wet than versus how it ends up drying. So again, following the direction of those wrinkles. I'm going to come back the other direction now, but I'm still whoops, that's too dark. I'm still slightly curving that brush, or the motion that I'm doing here. I'm not just making straight lines. Well, that was way too dark too. You can see I just softened it with my finger. Dabbed some of that off. You can see as those lines that I had done on the elephant's body, as that dries, look how much lighter those continuously get. So don't forget about that when you're drawing. Now, if you made them too bold and too bright, you can just glaze another color over them, so it's not that big of a deal. But it is something that you want to be aware of, that will happen. I didn't go too heavy, knowing that could be an issue. So you'll see, I mean, obviously, while this does not have anywhere near the detail I normally do, I want to bring up again how much fun I had. It was such a nice break from being the pressure of getting everything, trying to make everything look perfect all the time, to just have fun with the paint or the ink, however you want to word it. To have fun with that really made a very, very big difference. And the great thing was I finished this in about an hour or so, and then I started designing my next piece right away, and I was excited for the next piece with all of the detail. Normally when I'm working on something with detail, so often I'll be like, I don't want to put that fish in, it's going to take too long to draw, or whatever it is. In this case, because I had just taken this little break, done something for fun, when I was putting together the turtle, I didn't have that kind of lazy side of myself going, oh, I really don't want to draw that, so I'm not going to add it in. I was excited to go back to doing a ton of detail, and I think that that's really going to reflect in my next piece. So there were just so many benefits for me in doing this one, and definitely something I want to do more often because, again, so much fun. I was in such a happy mood while I did this, and after I finished it even. So I'm using that white and just defining that ear a little bit. It was kind of blending in with the side of his face there. Now, one of the things that I do when I'm painting looser is I do not let my reference photo be too close to me. I put it at a distance. I work off of a monitor. Normally when I work in colored pencil, I bring my monitor up very close to me. With this, I left it at a distance so that I couldn't see all the fine detail, and I really was just paying attention to the main highlights, the lights and the darks, the general motion of some of these details, but I couldn't see the teeny tiny detail, which is important for me in making sure that I don't start to try to add detail when my intent was not to do so. So I'm taking black now, and I am really outlining some of these very, very bold. I'm using quite a bit of pressure on the pencil there so that I get this very, very bold outline. Doing that on the ear. But I'm not just outlining everything. I'm just picking portions here and there, mostly on the right. I need a little bit of water so that I can get that much darker. And I'm not going to do too many brush strokes here. I don't want to blend and lose that heavy line. I just want to strengthen it a bit by adding some of that water. That's another tip I have for you. And really this would apply for any medium you're working in. When you blend, don't overdo it. Get it to where it's soft and then stop. Whatever your goal is, get it to that point and stop. So many people will just keep blending and blending and blending, and that's how they end up creating mud. You can do that. It's more common in oils, but I mean, you can make that happen in any medium. Don't overblend your work. I love to blend, but it needs to be done very sparingly so that it looks right. If you overdo it, you lose all of your lights and your darks and the differences between colors. Normally when blending, you only need to make a couple of brush strokes and that's it. So I've added a bit of magenta on the bottom of the ear and I'm pulling that up. Using that same magenta all over. And that is about it for this guy. If you have any questions, let me know. But again, so want to encourage you to try quick loose paintings or drawings like this. It is so much fun and such a nice break in between the really detailed stuff that we so often do.